Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I am Urza Master. Joining me as always is Lord Uther and Fert Derby. And today we are once again out on that 5-year mission, that 5-year journey that only lasted 3 years, with the crew of the NCC 1701 USS Enterprise. Gentlemen, welcome back
Hello.
to Starfleet Academy. We are talking the Mark of Gideon today. Another entry in Season 3. We are winding down the original series of Star Trek, and this one, this is going to be a discussion. I'm going to turn it right over to Fert Derby so we can get some background on this episode and all of the goings-on in 1969.
Thank you, Urza Master, Lord Uther, Warp Core fanatics. We are indeed in the final countdown of Star Trek Season 3, the original series. The Mark of Gideon, which first aired on January 17th, 1969. January 17th is also my anniversary with my beloved. So this aired 24 years to the day before I would meet the love of my life. So hello, sweetheart, and hello, Star Trek. Judd Taylor is our director, and we've seen Judd before. He did the Paradise Syndrome, which we all know was Kirk running around with the indigenous folk. And he also did Wink of an Eye, which we enjoyed, where beings were moving faster than the speed of sight on the Enterprise. So Judd is back, and we have an interesting writing credit this week. We have George Slavin, who honestly could not find very many credits or things to his name that were like interesting. And we had Stanley Adams, and we've seen Stanley Adams on the other side of the camera this Star Trek journey. He played Cyrano Jones in The Trouble with Tribbles, that pesky outer space dealer who had the little furry bags of trouble that overran the Enterprise and the Klingons. We talked about Trouble with Tribbles, a foundational and seminal episode of Star Trek in Warp Core 54. So you'll want to go back not only to see that episode, but to see our coverage of it. But Cyrano, he was the catalyst that stirred the pot, and Stanley Adams portrayed him on screen, kind of flamboyantly, a little bit larger than life. But it turns out he was not only an actor, he also made appearances on the big screen with Audrey Hepburn and George Peppard in Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was in Lilies of the Field. But he also did some work as a writer. As this Star Trek episode proves, he also wrote for Mr. Ed, Bonanza, and Gunsmoke, and The Flying Nun with Sally Field. So Mr. Adams had a colorful career, to say the least, and this was his contribution to the writing room of Star Trek. Beyond that, gentlemen, let's talk Mark of Gideon. Let's talk specifically what kind of an episode did we get. It starts off very promising with an eerie corridors, an empty Enterprise. It had a lot of Halloween energy. It just so happens that we're screening this fairly close to All Hallows Eve in 2024. And even though it aired in January, there's a spookiness to it, sort of from the outset. It seems more authentic than like a Cat's Paw, where they went out of their way to give us ghosts and black cats and things that go bump in the night. And we finally had a reading on the crew. 429 crew members were, quote, missing. So that's nice to know how much it takes to fill a Constitution starship in Starfleet. It was a heavy Spock episode, which was good, because I thought that particularly when Spock was trying to negotiate with the Planetary Council and with Starfleet, his sort of back and forths with the Enterprise bridge crew as he was trying to unravel this knot and then solve this problem. It reminded me of dealing with Starfleet in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, when he was on the bridge and having to try and find the search for the weapons and the traitorous crewmen and so forth. So I got a Star Trek VI vibe, and I'm sure the Nicholas Meyer and the writers on that may have looked back at this episode, just a little bit of that vibe. We had some floaty green heads that made their appearance about halfway through the episode. So that's always a good Star Trek trope. And a recent Star Trek trope, particularly this season, in which we had Kirk sort of as the other, as sort of removed from the action, whether he was on another dimensional plane or whether he was literally in a physical other space. This happened to him in the Tholian Web. It happened to him in Wink of an Eye, which was directed by this week's Judd Taylor. So this is at least the third instance I can find where the crew is puzzled by the disappearance of their captain and has to kind of puzzle out how to get him back. Gentlemen, I think it's a strong Star Trek episode when it talks about what is the purpose of Star Trek, right? And so we have another moral dilemma, this planet that's dying, and they need the antibodies and so forth from Kirk in order to help facilitate a vaccine and a cure. The problem is it's going to come at a personal cost to Kirk and the members of the council. And so there's a lot of debate in this episode. There's a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of, sort of for the time, it was a very, I don't want to call it an Aaron Sorkin-like episode, because that is a different level of writing entirely. But it was a thoughtful trek. There were not a lot of phaser battles, if any. There were not any ship-to-ship battles. There was no Klingons or Romulans or some other thing, truly threatening the Enterprise. The threat instead was something that had to be gamed out and strategized and solved. And so it was a very talky episode. And while I'm, as a writer and a fan, I'm always big on those and would never, turn my back on something that brought up thought-provoking discussions and so forth. It might have played a little slow to somebody who wanted more like the Tholian Web, or something with a little, even Let This Be Your Last Battlefield, with warring aliens on the bridge and fire, phasers and so on and so forth. So it'll be interesting how it read with you guys, because I think in terms of trying to accomplish the mission, here is another, quality, standalone 50-minute episode that purports to follow the principles of Gene Roddenberry and what this show really wants to be. And maybe they're still, wrestling to get back that voice from previous seasons, as we come to the end, or at least at what we know to be the end. They may not have known at the time. But season 3 might be finding its stride at long last in terms of consistency and so forth. I liked it. I liked this episode. I don't see why any free-thinking fan of Star Trek wouldn't look at this and say, yeah, this is one that exemplifies the traditions and the principles of this crew. What do you guys say? Were you marked?
Yeah, I loved it. Definitely the literature fan in me was excited about this one because it was very cerebral. But it was a Jack Kevorkian argument, right? This is a planet so overcrowded by its longevity that it longs to murder or commit suicide, and that's one of those sci-fi tropes I think that comes up every so often, and I don't know if television tends to stray away from it or not, but this played it pretty well. Especially of the era, it wasn't too in your face because it probably couldn't have been. It gave you the classic Kirk, falls for the girls situation, and McCoy saves the day, medically speaking, and it's a logical argument. It's the big three played out in the story, which I think is the true strength of the original series. So the fact that they could tie the story into that parallel masterful. Was it the most exciting episode? Not really. I think it was a little bit just odd. I think we were all kind of confused by the way that the Prime Minister of Gideon was kind of interacting with Spock, and it was supposed to be confusing because Spock was supposed to be confused. Obviously, he was logical and methodical of figuring it out, but it really played very nicely. It was tight. It wasn't overachieving. It wasn't underachieving. It felt like a very solid episode in a season where solid episodes are hard to come by. Not exactly a filler episode. I think it dealt with a lot of really high gravity material, which is, for the era, pretty potent. But this was also kind of the era that these discussions were vogue too. So it was really good. I can't say I'd put it in my top 10 for sure, but it's certainly an episode I'd recommend. It might not be must-watch Trek, but it's one that, you get the pretty girl, you get Kirk being a ladies' man, but he's in a very unique, unusual scenario. And I like the trope of the lost captain. That's something this season that I think has shined among a lot of dull stones.
Yeah, it's just a good sci-fi mystery episode, and I like to see the contrast in terms of command style between Spock and Kirk, and how the bridge reacts to Spock a little differently, and he always just reasons his way right through it all, and it to see those looks on their faces when they're like, oh, that logic does make sense. I understand that now. I see where he's going, because sometimes they're wondering what he's talking about. That's always good to see. Yeah, we get the classic Kirk, the little side love story there. But like you said, Urza, it's just a good, straightforward, to the point episode that, again, might not make your top 10. But the one other thing I'll throw out there is just sometimes you need good sci-fi. Again, to your point that there's not a phaser battle, and I was telling you guys I was watching 2010, the year we made contact, and there's something that's just a mystery that's just good, well-written dialogue and sci-fi that always keeps you wondering. And not that this episode is 2010, but I think it shows one of the reasons why people love that element of sci-fi so much. Where's this going? How are you going to figure this out? There's all these possibilities. So, good episode.
I think it doesn't hurt to have Roy Scheider and John Lithgow in your cast as well. So, and a very young Helen Mirren as the Russian captain of that ship. Peter Hyams, if you haven't seen it, the sequel to Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece 2001, but very different. Whereas Stanley Kubrick waxed poetic and lyrical about space and made sort of a dream tome poem. Peter Hyams' sequel is very much a nuts and bolts science fiction, as Lord Uther says, mystery, almost thriller, but just done exceptionally well. So check that out, Warp Core fans. It's a little adjacent, but you'll definitely get some Star Trek vibes if you look for it there. What's interesting, gentlemen, because again, I came to this franchise through the features and are only now discovering the wonders of the original episodes as we embark on our Warp Core journeys here, now 81 strong. McCoy and Spock seem to me the characters that translated the smoothest to the big screen as far as who they are now. When I see Spock on the bridge in this episode telling Uhura to talk to Starfleet, and then I see him negotiating with the Prime Minister on the view screen, I don't see any difference between that and what we got in Star Trek's 4, 5, 6, the Next Generation episodes he popped in on. The J.J. Abrams Bad Robot episodes, like Leonard Nimoy knew who this character was from the outset and found it himself, and there's a straight through line in this viewer's opinion between what he was doing in '69 and what he was doing in '84. And I think DeForest Kelley also, the irascible Bones. I mean, he's been a bit more randy and a bit more, I won't say flamboyant, but a little bit more. He's actually been bigger on the small screen. They sort of reined that back in, but he's also been consistent. Whereas you have, Scotty is a different physical look, and I just have a different impression of Montgomery Scott as an older gentleman in the features than I do as a young, engineering, commander and transporter lead. So he's different for me, and of course, William Shatner evolves, and I mean, well, we'll always have that James Rascally Kirk, again, the feature films sort of highlight a different sense of quality about him versus when he was younger and fitter and running around in the yellow velour. So I mean, your thoughts, gentlemen? Just my observation is how wonderful it was to see Leonard Nimoy and be able to flash forward 30 years in my imagination and say, yep, he's going to be like this when they're trying to get Kirk and Bones off the prison planet, the Rurapente, and so forth. It's kind of weird. I mean, it's like you're seeing and hearing the future, even though you wouldn't have known that in '69. It's just, again, a terrific job by Mr. Nimoy.
Yeah, I think that if there's anything to take away from season 3 is that each of the cast members has found their character. And that's one thing that, despite some of the episodes not being very good this season, all of the characterization, all of the acting has been spot on to where it's going to be for the rest of the original series cruise run. With the exception, I think, of Montgomery Scott's hair, which thankfully finally changed about midway through the season. But I really like the point you bring up about how you can very plainly see that they knew these characters. Because it is kind of interesting from an acting point of view. Like, there are people who they think of characters as very separate from themselves. You look at some of the modern television actors who played a character for years and years, or even movie actors who are like, they almost refer to them as another person, but these actors, and I know it was the fear, especially of Leonard Nimoy, they really are those characters. When I see William Shatner and other things, he's a great range, but, it's either some form of Captain Kirk or Denny Crane. There's a great range in between those two, and he can hit a million notes. He's a brilliant actor, along with all the others, but it's incredible to think that, no matter what, I sort of see Kirk in him always. And I don't see a separation between the two. If William Shatner was talking about Captain Kirk, I really don't think he'd be talking about Captain Kirk as Kirk would do this. I think he would talk about him as, I would do this. Because Kirk is me. I am him. And I think Nimoy and DeForest Kelley, certainly George Takei, they just really settled into those characters so well that I know we've tried to reboot them. I know we've got Strange New Worlds, which is introducing new folks who are doing a great job. Not to take away anything from that, but this, if there's one good thing about season 3 and all the crap that it's taken us through, it is that it really solidified these characters as these actors. And I don't think that you can separate them successfully in the future. You have to give some nods to, and Strange New World does it well, some nods to their characterization or their style or how they deliver lines, how they carry themselves on a screen. That to me is just something that I've come to notice, especially recently. This episode, a great showcase of which, where you get that wily Captain Kirk that we see in Star Trek 4. I mean, you get that kind of drinking beer and eating pizza at the restaurant, and then back to business. It's just so cool to see those little moments, and it's just there it is. This is when he found that. So, like I said, It's not a top 10 episode, but I think this episode certainly brings that to light, which is not for nothing. So, gentlemen, let's hop to our Warp Core ratings. And I want to start with Lord Uther this week. The Mark of Gideon. How did you feel about it?
I think it's a solid 5. You know, it gets its sci-fi mystery piece done. The big 3 carry it through. Again, probably not a top 10 for me, but just a solid sci-fi episode. How about you, Fert?
Oh yeah, it's a Glen Ellen 5. I mean, it might only be a Windy City 4.5, but it's a Glen Ellen 5 right here. And again, because we don't, I would have thought that the networks and the notes and everyone's like, you know, every week we've got to have something big and splashy. We got to have asteroids that will crash on the planet. We got to have Klingon battleships. You can see how that probably was maybe some of the notes. You know, we need alien creatures that look exotic. We need beautiful women. I mean, the idea that you can do more. I mean, that's something that can choke a show off creatively as well, even if you're getting a lot of splashy special effects and eye candy, etc. And it was just nice because, like, I mean, as Urza puts it, and we've sort of mentioned, I mean, it just felt more cerebral, more just here's an actual dilemma. Put yourself in their shoes. Would you make those choices? Would you go a different route? Whereas, et cetera, et cetera. How far would you go to solve this problem? And so I think I'm happy for it. I'm happy that they were able to put this out there without going back to, Roman gladiators have taken over television, and now the future is ratings. I mean, there's something to be said. Less is more, and I think this one gives us that.
That's a great point. I like that. That's why Michael Bay should never make a Star Trek movie. No offense. I actually do enjoy Michael Bay movies. I'm not going to lie. I am not a Michael Bay hater necessarily, but there's something to be said about adding too much flash and effect and not achieving really anything. Not that I don't love eye candy and flash and effect. Don't get me wrong. I am all for unplugging and just watching an entertaining flick. But yeah, this has really been a solid 5 of an episode for me as well. I love the storytelling. I love the heavy subject matter it deals with rather lightly. And not lightly in the fact that it doesn't take it seriously, but lightly in the fact that it doesn't burden you with the subject matter. And I go back to what I said last week, is that there are a lot of great TV shows these days that address real life heavy topics. Overpopulation could be one of them. But I defy writers of this era, our era, to write something like this, where it does not beat you over the head, does not make you feel guilty or bad. It just makes you think and consider, which I think is far more effective and far more potent than anything Law & Order SVU has ever done. So with that, we journey back off onto this 5-year mission that lasted 3. And next week will be our 82nd episode. So if you have missed any so far, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button, drop us a like, give us a comment. How did you feel about the Mark of Gideon? Head back to the Starfleet archives here on the Warp Core podcast playlist. Work through from episode 1, Star Trek the Motion Picture, all the way through Strange New World Season 1, Strange New World Season 2, and Star Trek the Original Series. All the films that count have been talked about, and we move boldly where no Warp Core has ever gone before. But until then, live long and prosper.